Greetings, people of Earth. It is today, and we are here. My name is Patrick Grant, and like the three states of matter, my career is threefold in that I am a producer, composer, and performer of new music. Time's not going to allow me to speak much of my background. They can be found on my website. I left cards out there that will bring you to plenty of audio examples and video examples of everything I'm about to explain. But I will say that science has always been an inspiration to my musical composition in concert and on stage. In 2003, I received a commission and permission from author Matt Ridley to use his book, Genome, The Autobiography of a Species, as a programmatic structure in a new composition for my ensemble accompanied by video projection. These concerts were in observance of the 50th anniversary of the discovery of DNA, and I sent out announcements to every organization I thought might be interested. One of the responses I got was from Adrienne Klein, co-director of the Science and Arts series here at CUNY. She expressed interest in the project, and after some exchange of materials with series director Brian Schwartz, they invited me to perform excerpts from the work at CUNY later that season. Brian and Adrienne attended one of those performances, and I remember how Adrienne, a visual artist herself, was particularly taken with my diagram of the piece's structure and how the color coding showed the entrance and return of musical themes. A few years later, Brian contacted me about the creation of a new piece. This one would be based on the creation of the universe, and I would be able to work with an actual scientist on this one, and I loved that idea. He and Adrienne suggested that I develop the piece with the astronomer Charles Liu from the Museum of Natural History. He liked the stage, was definitely not shy in front of a microphone, and had done similar work in getting the message of science across to a wider public. We spoke on the phone, hit it off, and agreed, let's do it. We should meet and begin the work. And I'm thinking, how? The premiere was scheduled for later that spring. It was a couple months for a big piece, so I decided I had to find a method. I figured I had already read enough books and seen enough video regarding the Big Bang Theory to fill a small library, so for this piece, I wanted the text to come from a more relaxed place, that of simple conversation. I would videotape my meetings with Charles, and later with Brian, and transcribe them myself, first by hand, and then by typing it into a Word document for editing. The text that was generated by these Big Bang conversations were all over the place in terms of subject and sequence. I decided to print out and cut up into single sentences and physically post them in an order that fit the Big Bang's timeline. Doing so, I began to see patterns emerge and decided to let them help inform the structure. One of these patterns that emerged was that of metaphor in explaining scientific concepts. In a piece like this, it especially made sense, and I think that's one of the things we've been talking about all day here, especially in music, the use of metaphor. It seemed to me like this piece couldn't be anything but metaphors about metaphors. How else to describe what we can know intellectually but cannot perceive directly with our senses? Having the Big Bang text whittled down into a size that created a satisfactory narrative, it was time to fit it all into a structure that made musical sense. I created a diagram in 13 parts that was similar in concept to the one that I made for Genome. I began the actual musical part of the piece. It would be performed by my own ensemble of 3 electronic keyboards and percussion. Performing on top of this would be the text, spoken by Charles Liu in what had come to be known as the role of a benign astronomer narrator. To create that, I recorded the text myself and put the music to it just to see that they would sync up correctly. Musically, I couldn't let it get overly busy. The astronomer's part was still very texty. Despite my cutting it down, the music was in danger of getting in the way. It had to assume more of an underscoring role while still being as interesting as possible. Now, the final layer needed for the piece was that of visuals. For this production, I put together a PowerPoint presentation of slides I created and of pictures I found from various sources. Sometimes they mark out what the text is saying, and at other times they purposely worked against it like a counterpoint. This aspect could point out an irony in the text, or would, at its best, create yet another layer of metaphor over what was being heard. For me, this remains the tricky part, and one that I hope a dedicated visual artist could develop in the future, and I'm going to speak more on that possibility later. Little did we know in the rehearsal process that besides being an actual astronomer, Charles was also a convincing baritone with a talent for heavy metal and the occasional show tune. Had I known that, I would have worked it into the piece if only there was more time, because the date of the premiere grew close. At last, we performed Big Bang for live ensemble and multimedia right here in CUNY's Elebash Hall on May 15th, 2006. Everything went well, and I'm always having a heartache and heart attack over it. But it went well because when you consider how much tech was being operated live by so few performers, it was really good, and I was really happy that we got this thing out of the ground. We had subsequent performances here at CUNY, and it was performed at other New York City venues as the grand finale of my ensemble's concerts that season. I'm grateful that the process and the piece were so well documented that I can make this presentation here. It is through this documentation that I wish to take the piece, as it were, a step further, and that's what this talk is really about. Even when I was creating it, I always had a nagging feeling that it could go deeper than the time frame I had to do it in 2006, would allow. So earlier this year, I began to transfer many of the archived videos of my work, and Big Bang was amongst the first that I properly edited together. It was a 3-camera shoot with great sound, and it did a great job in showing what the piece was. I broke the piece down to its 13 parts and posted them online. The public's response has been overwhelmingly good. That was the tipping point in my deciding to return to the piece, and if you pardon the expression, expand the Big Bang. So I'm going to tell you my thoughts on how I see this coming to pass. Much of the interest generated in the posting of the Big Bang video came from theater companies here in the US and in Europe. It was proposed to me by some of these companies that the piece become a chamber opera. So I was thinking, okay, how could this be done? First and foremost, in my opinion, would be ways to extend the piece's main device, and that is in its use of metaphor. In the original version, I felt much need to explain, or prove, rather, the physics behind the changes taking place in the universe. There would be less need for this now. Things could simply be. If I say the universe expands, fine. I don't have to tell you exactly that some guy sitting in a shack with a radio receiver was part of that equation. We can simply move from that, and as such, the events can retain much of their, in my opinion, natural beauty while raising the level of, and this is important to me, their mystery, while still being scientifically accurate. This would automatically result in a radical reduction of the amount of text and make more room for music. Why is this? Because I envision the text to be sung as much as possible. Anybody who knows music knows that a scant amount of text can result in a relatively large amount of music. With this being so, the pared-down text has to be especially emblematic and graspable by the public. We all know how much poetry and song thrive on metaphor, and this is no exception. Now it's good to ask, to be sung by whom? The role of the astronomer would be retained, kept as a kind of guide for us throughout the piece, with the addition of 4 more singer-actors. They would represent, structurally, not anthropomorphologically, the 4 forces of the universe: gravity, the strong force, the weak force, and the electromagnetic force. These parts would be sung by a soprano, an alto, a tenor, and a bass. One could say that this represents humanity, but it really just gives the composer the widest range of voices to work with. The role of the astronomer is open, in my opinion. It could be a male baritone as in the original, although I'm playing with the idea of it being a musically trained, very wise-sounding child. It's just an idea right now, but there is a quality of non-judgmental innocence, though all-knowing, that I wish to retain, whomever that part goes to. What's important is that the splitting the text like this brings about new possibilities of staging, counterpoint, and furthering the use of metaphor in the piece. Staging begins with the sheer geography of having 5 different singer-actors within the performance space. I do not wish the singers to assume the park and bark stance of operatic antiquity. The use of headset microphones will enable them to include movement into the performance through the use of a choreographer and, as they have in Europe, a dramaturg, to pull out any narrative action that is inherent within the text. For example, the splitting of the forces, the clustering of the galaxies, etc. As for the element of counterpoint, I have pointed out its possibilities, as many of you have here too, that it is an expression of the metaphor of the music of the spheres, that is, circles within circles, that of many individual parts working together as an organized whole, like the universe itself. It can also be very helpful in communicating complicated blocks of text. There's the scene in the 1984 film Amadeus in which Mozart explains his vision for the end of the marriage of Figaro to his patrons. In essence, what would be a group of people babbling at the same time in real life would become a coherent expression of simultaneous meanings when brought together in music. A new Big Bang would especially benefit from this device since it deepens the metaphor of how the universe works as well as becoming a device through which concepts can be shown through sound. For example, harmonies can expand if we're talking about expansion and the like. In a chamber opera version, this would be the strongest device in communicating the scientific concepts of the piece to the general public it was intended for. Finally, this brings us to the visual element. Much of what I see these days in the use of visuals for live musical performance is nothing more than a fancy computer-generated screensaver moving around amorphously independent of the sound, and I do not wish for any of that. Any visuals should be timed to the score, much as anyone would expect in a synchronized film. We have the technology to do this live. Any staging requires the use of theatrical lighting. It's rather obvious that any piece about the universe will use light, given the subject matter, but perhaps a little more self-consciously so. The human eye will always be drawn to where any light is coming from, and that too can amplify, as it always have, the telling of a narrative, especially when the topic concerns the nature of light itself. What would be new, and especially crucial, is the use of video in the piece. For this, I am seeking a true collaborator in the form of a filmmaker video artist. Many of the concepts regarding the universe can be achieved as we have seen them done in so many PBS animations, as well as dating back to the Ames brothers' classic Powers of 10, and the use of video like this is to be expected. What I would really like to see added to the piece, and this is where the filmmaker role comes in, is a device that would be added to the visuals that would greatly enhance, I feel, its metaphoric qualities upon which the whole piece is driven. This device would be the addition of original and stock footage, used either within or simultaneously the visuals described earlier, of that of the lifespan of a human. It would span from conception to death, paralleling the life and death of the known universe, which Big Bang details. I would be very careful to point out that the use of this device is not to see the universe anthropomorphologically as related to the human experience, but as the other way around, the human as seen from the perspective of the universe. This distinction is crucial to me in communicating Big Bang's main metaphor. We all come from that same singularity. We all exist because of the universe. It doesn't exist for us. We are all of the same material, you and me, it and us, working on different scales of magnitude. I purposefully leave the question why to the audience. That is the eternal unanswered question that has driven us ever forward in our pursuits. The older I get, the more comfortable I am in accepting that I'll never know all the answers, and I think that's what it means to be part of something bigger than ourselves. So I leave you with the words that open and close Big Bang because it is perhaps the only thing I can say about the universe with any level of certainty. It is today, and we are here. Thank you.